Hey everybody, congrats on getting your midterm completed and getting some good progress done on that essay. And for those of you who haven't submitted it, please submit it. Better late than never. So let's get going, let's continue, and let's learn about elections and campaigns. Today's learning objectives consist of some analyses of various electoral processes and how you have to maintain an electoral system in a pluralist society in order to maintain that definition truly. We're going to understand these definitions. We're going to look at how our Constitution guides the electoral process, how we've amended our Constitution regarding the electoral process, a look at hard and soft money in politics, and a examination of what it means to have open and closed primaries and what system we have in Montana. So what does our Constitution say about the electoral process? We have a handful of amendments that guide this process in the United States, starting with the 12th Amendment, which we remember from earlier lectures and how we had the impacts from the 1796 and 1800 elections, had to re-examine how we elect the president and the vice president, having them be on separate ballots in addition to having the House of Representatives break any tie among our electors in our electoral college. 17th Amendment gave people the right to vote for their senators, which was previously done through state legislatures, expanding the access to voting within the United States, within our federal government. 19th Amendment legally granted women the right to vote in the early 1900s, providing full women's suffrage in the United States. 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in national elections, providing more access to minority collectives that were having a hard time reaching the polls due to state restrictions. 26th Amendment makes the legal voting age 18 instead of 21 in response to protests regarding Vietnam and having many young 18-year-old individuals sent to war when they could not legally vote. And in response, they lowered the voting age. Let's talk about pluralism again. So I know I've covered pluralism multiple times in this course, and I've given you a different definition in the past. But if you analyze that definition and the one I'm giving you now, it is stating the same thing just from a different perspective. Previously, I talked about it as a system in government in which you have multiple groups vying for power within that single system of government. Pluralism in this term is a condition or system in which two or more groups, states, principles, and sources of authority, or etc., coexist. Now, we of course know we live in a pluralist system, and we have to figure out ways to have an electoral process that provides for majority rule with minority protections and minority access to government representation. So when we look at pluralism in effect in the United States, we do see two terms used quite often that we should have a concrete definition for. Those are majority rule and the plurality rule. First, majority rule. This is a simple state that if you are in a majority rule state, Georgia and 7 others, and you do not obtain 50%, no candidate obtains 50% plus one vote of the electorate, they will then have a runoff election, sometimes disqualifying lower candidates if they did not reach certain standards or whatever other rules the state may use. We see this in recent years through Georgia as there was a nationally focused election there, and that is why I use that one singled out. Now we also have to understand what plurality rule is. This is where we have plurality voting, and it's a simple rule that states the candidate with the most votes wins. You do not have to have the majority of the voting population voting for you. You just have to have more votes than your political opponents. We will have elections where there are 5 candidates running, and the winner of the election obtains 30% of the vote, and they will win the entirety, if it is a presidential election, entirety of their electoral college votes, or they will win the office independently. And now let's talk about what a winner-takes-all election is. This is an electoral system where whoever wins the election, regardless of how you win it, regardless of you have a majority rule or plurality rule, if you win the election, you will then get 100% of the state's electoral college votes or win the office entirely and independently. Now, as I just stated, this does not require a majority vote, although in some states they have the ability to require the majority vote, and they do. This does not address how you win, just what we do once you have won the election regarding electoral votes in presidential elections. There's a president in the presidential election, and this is how we see electoral college votes sometimes distributed to candidates on the national level with a majority that does not have the popular votes majority. We've seen this in 5 elections, 2 in the modern era, 1 George Bush, in his first campaign for president and Donald Trump in his first campaign for president, they both in their second campaigns received the majority vote and the electoral college vote. Now we see in the United States, 48 out of the 50 states have winner-takes-all systems, excluding Maine and Nebraska, in which we distribute the electoral college votes based on the proportion of the vote of the population voting for each political party's candidate. So winner takes all. Whoever wins the election, however you win, you will then obtain 100% of the electoral college votes. And in contrast, we can see first past the post, where we address how a candidate can win the election. Not what we do with the electoral college votes after they win, but how will we determine who the winner is. And in a first past the post election, you have plurality rule in effect. This is where you have single member districts where you elect one individual, but we do not require that the winner of the election to obtain 51% of the electoral college vote, or I mean, not the electoral college vote, the popular vote. You simply need to get more votes than your opponent. Now remember, we can have more than two candidates, and we often do. We have third-party candidates, as we had acknowledged last week, Libertarian, Green Party, Independent, and other parties that come and go throughout each electoral process. So we know that first past the post indicates that you do not need 50% of the vote or 51% of the vote. You simply need more votes than your opponents. We have this in effect in the vast majority of the United States, and we see in Maine and Alaska we have systems of ranked choice voting, which we will go into in just a moment. And now let's look at ranked choice voting. So ranked choice voting is an electoral system in which you're able to rank candidates based on preference on your ballot. So you're not necessarily voting for just one candidate, although in the United States we do have ranked choice voting systems in which we do also have single member districts and elect one winner of the election, but we use a different system to determine who that winner is. Now, as a result of having ranked choice voting in Maine, Alaska, and other regions of the world, we see this opens the door for third parties and other parties down the road. It increases the likelihood of moderate representatives, as you have a higher incentive to appeal to a wider spectrum of voters, as you may not be their first choice, but you can likely be their second, and after a second or third round of voting, you may be the winner of the election based on your second and third ranked votes. Now, this is a system where you do need 50% of the vote. You will have a first round of voting. Say you have 5 candidates, but nobody obtains 50%. Well, the second round would say if you haven't met a certain threshold, or if you're the lowest 2 vote getters, you will be eliminated from the election, and everybody who chose you as their first candidate will then have their second and third choices go into effect. It will incentivize those candidates from primary parties to appeal to those third-party candidates and moderates more in the middle, and we have seen through data in the states of Maine and Alaska, although these new systems have been implemented relatively recently, that this system has increased moderate representation minimally, but it has, and increased the likelihood of third parties. Now, we also see this is on the ballot in numerous states. So we can see over the next few years, it may be implemented in other states in this region or out. I know in Montana, we had the ability to vote on a similar system in the last election, although it was not passed, so we will not be reviewing that. And if there is another one that is passed in the future, we'll look into it. So let's look at political primaries, because we have to understand the general election process happens in 2 steps, a primary and then the general election. So political parties have the sole authority over how primary elections operate. This we will look at in next week's lecture, how it impacts civil rights and civil liberties in the United States, as we have seen certain practices during the primary process in which we've restricted voting access to certain minorities. But we will look at that in the later lectures. Today, let's look at a distinction between open and closed primaries and understand what a caucus is. So a closed primary is when only declared party members can vote in the primary election. Now, Montana has a closed primary system. You would, in Montana, during a primary election, obtain maybe 4 ballots, a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or whatever, maybe Green Party, I'm not certain, you would have all these ballots sent to your door if you were an early voter, or if you went to the polls, you would have access to all of these ballots. You would then be able to choose only one to vote on and then send back or vote on at the polls. Now, the incentive for doing this is that in open primaries, certain people argue that you would be encouraged to vote for the opposing party's least likely candidate and have strategic voting encouraged. Now, a closed primary process prevents strategic voting, and although you may be voting for one political party in the primary process, you are able to switch your vote in the general election. You can then vote for every candidate on the opposing ballot if that is your interest. So you are only able in a closed primary to vote for one political party's primary ballot. In an open primary, in contrast, this is where people can vote in the primary election regardless of their party identification and cast votes in either political party's primaries. And we see in the United States, 21 states have at least one political party conduct open primaries for congressional and state level offices. In 14 states, at least one political party conducts closed primaries for congressional and state level offices. In 15 states, we see semi-closed primaries for congressional and state level offices. If you're interested in the process of semi-closed primaries and the specifics of the differences between each state, I'm happy to talk to you about that via email or in an additional lecture over Zoom, but I will not spend that time today covering that. Instead, let's continue and cover what a caucus is. A caucus is similar to a primary, but you can more so visualize this as everyone being there in one place at one time, being able to vote in person or remotely in some sense. We didn't see the primary process be truly established nationally until the 1970s. If you look at a history of political parties and how they elected their candidates, it was often through caucuses, although this practice has been outdated in recent years and has transitioned to be a more image-based, show-based event at the end of an electoral primary process where we have the national convention and we have caucuses there and we cast their votes via delegates. Now, I do want to state a semi-closed primary, since I did mention it a second ago, is when you can vote in either political party's primary, but you can only vote in a single primary. You don't have to declare your party affiliation on the ballot. Some interesting details. The first state to implement primaries for federal elections was Oregon in 1910, and it was 1970s when this system became a normal practice. So let's look at political campaigns and specifically the institutions in which we funnel money to fund political campaigns. There are two specific ones that I want to analyze today and acknowledge the origins of super PACs through Citizens United. So let's look at political action committees. These are committees representing interest groups, labor unions, or corporations that raise and distribute campaign funds as they see fit. Now, political action committees oftentimes obtain their funding through small-scale donors, like individuals within the United States, and have strict regulations on how much they can raise from each individual and how they can distribute their funds, with a little bit more freedom on how they can distribute those funds, but there are caps. They can give to certain candidates freely, but only to certain extents. They can only raise so much money for one specific candidate. Now, and obtain so much money from one specific individual. Now, these are oftentimes we have political action committees that represent the most niche and general interest in the United States. We have some like Mothers Against Drunk Driving that are so specific that they are a collection of mothers trying to implement policies that protect individuals from drunk driving instances. We have interest groups that represent every niche issue you can identify, and oftentimes they are not just there to represent the interest of those who pay the most money, but instead those who maintain the values that the interest group represents. Now, they also have interest groups representing certain labor unions, corporations, and any general collective you can think of in the United States. There is a high likelihood there is an interest group in their favor campaigning and lobbying within the United States. Now, how does this differ from a super PAC? Well, a super PAC came as a result of Citizens United 2010 Supreme Court ruling, in which we established that limitations, in certain sense, this is a oversimplification, but a simple understanding of it, that certain limitations on spending in politics is equal to limitations on free speech. So it expanded the ability for certain corporations to spend in politics, and this would be through what is now established as super PACs, super political action committees. These are political action committees with unlimited contributions, but once they obtain those unlimited contributions from whatever sources they obtain them from, they cannot directly interact with any campaigns. You will see political super PACs fund campaign, not campaign ads, but ads regarding specific policy issues, indicating that a certain candidate may be your ideal candidate if you are concerned about this issue, but they cannot fund the campaign directly, and they cannot get the concerns of the candidate and their campaign in regard to how they will send the message. So you will see a lot of indirect interaction, well, no interaction at all, but you will see similar messaging sometimes by like-minded super PACs and like-minded candidates. But we see expanded access to funding with unlimited contributions for political action committees with expanded regulations on how they will spend those funds, while political action committees have heightened regulations on how you will obtain the funds, but lessened regulation regarding how the political action committee will then spend the funds. Now let's once again look at Citizens United. You see I have 2009 here and 2010 on the last slide. That is because they began hearing the case in late 2009 and provided a ruling in 2010. And sometimes I should probably just change that, but I won't, because it's a way for me to remember to tell you that random little detail. So what is the conclusion of this Supreme Court ruling? It is that any regulation on money in politics equates a regulation on free speech, as I previously mentioned. And as a result, we see the establishment of super political action committees in the United States. Our textbook states, quote, "The main beneficiaries of the new rules were not corporations, but ideological interest groups that were often funded by extremely wealthy individuals," end quote. You see this claim made by our textbook that we use and supported throughout literature, focusing on how it opened the door for those to provide heightened contributions to super PACs and have them provide ads that are more impactful as they have greater outreach through more funding, although they are unable to directly interact with the candidates. Now, again, that is the main takeaway regarding what a super PAC is. They are a political action committee that can receive unlimited amounts of money from corporations, unions, and other groups, but they have limitations on how they will spend that money. As a result of Citizens United 2009 hearings and 2010 ruling, we see the amount of money in politics has exponentially increased, as we've seen countless data points on that. And if you're interested, I am happy to provide more information on this via email. Now, when we look at that money, the money going through politics, that increased amount of funding going to our national and state level elections, we see a stark distinction we have to make between soft and hard money. Now, hard money consists of funds contributed directly to candidates by individuals or political action committees. Remember, there are not heightened regulations on how political action committees can distribute their funds, and they are able to contribute directly to candidates. When the political action committee provides funds to the candidate, that is an example of hard money. Now, we looked at soft money in state and federal elections. This consists of funds contributed to state or local parties or to a national party for the purpose of running state elections or conducting local grassroots political activity. Think of this as money going through the institution of political parties prior to reaching the candidates themselves. We see soft money, goes through the soft money goes through the institutions, while hard money goes directly to candidates and their campaigns. And when we talk about elections, we cannot go without acknowledging the Electoral College, and also acknowledging the reality that when you look at the origins of the Electoral College, this is a compromise made by our founding fathers. Some wanted the president to be appointed by a Senate, and others had the opposing viewpoint and wanted the president to be determined through a popular vote of, well, at that time, qualified citizens, end quote. And we see our Constitution providing the foundations of electors in our 12th Amendment, which more directly guides our electoral process that we know today, revolving around the presidency. we do have the acknowledgement that if we are to ever consider abolishing the Electoral College, which is oftentimes a point of discussion and debate in early American government courses and a point of interest among students in government courses, that you would need to enact a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. This is required because in order to change the Constitution, you must do it through only one avenue, and that avenue is another constitutional amendment. We also look at history, and we'll look at this again when we look at how change has been implemented throughout U.S. history and the use of filibuster. If you're interested, I can tell you more about that via email regarding this issue as well. But we see there was an amendment proposed to abolish the Electoral College in the 1970s, and Gallup polling at the time showed 80% popular support for this amendment, and it passed through the House with flying colors. But once it reached the Senate, it was struck down due to a very successful filibuster. And again, I will happily tell you more information about that filibuster and unique moment in history if you're interested. So here's today's What Did We Learn slides. Make sure you review. Here are the answers to those What Did We Learn slides, the main takeaways we need to remember, and what's due this week. We do have an assignment. Take what you've learned today and try and identify what your ideal election would be. Try and tell me the structure. Would you have winner takes all, first past the post? Ranked choice voting, why would you have it? Is there a problem you think this electoral system would solve compared to what we have today? Or do you think our electoral system is so strong we need to maintain it? And if anything, strengthen it, or just simply maintain the status quo? And why would that be your argument? It is a brief paper. I believe in you. If you need any help, just reach out. Always happy to give you tips via email. And yeah, great talking to you this week.